Well, welcome all you wiretappers out there. I'm here in the Gangland Wire studio in the home, not going out with this COVID virus thing. And I know a lot of you guys are stuck at home too. So, I'm putting out some extra episodes. I've been interviewing somebody almost every day. And, I'm running through all the people in the United States. So I had to reach out to my friend up in Canada. And there's a lot of true crime fans in Canada. I've noticed that, man. There is a bunch of you guys up there. I guess those long, cold winter nights, you got to have something to do.
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
anyhow, folks, this is Nate Henley, a well-known true crime author and scriptwriter, and has done about everything. He's really has a whole career in this business. This is kind of my third career, so he's had a whole career in this. Welcome, Nate.
Thank you very much, Gary. Appreciate this. And I was just saying that hopefully we'll be able to provide some nice content for the self-isolating true crime fans who are sitting at home wanting something to do. I live in Toronto, as Gary said. I was actually born in the U.S. My family is American background. I was born in Connecticut and have lived in Canada all my life, though. I write for various business and trade magazines, and I do true crime books as sort of my fun writing, so to speak. I've written about wrongful murder convictions and gangsters and organized crime, kind of the same thing, illegal drugs, Bonnie and Clyde, all sorts of different topics. And I just enjoy the genre very much and enjoy talking about it. And looking forward to talking to you, Gary.
All right, great. Well, now you have, how can folks get a hold of you and see your work? Do you have like an author page on Amazon? Plus, I see you've got your own website, a couple of websites.
Yeah, the easiest way for people to check out either my books or my background is through my website, which is just simply natehendley.com, natehendley.com. It's got all my books listed, and it's got links to where you can buy them at the usual suspects, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, up here in Canada, Indigo Chapters, and anything you're interested in, you can just click on and download or get a paper copy in the mail. Right, I also have a crime blog called Crime Story at WordPress. So crimestory.wordpress.com.
All right, great. I see you've put some clips up from some other podcast interviews that you've done. You're familiar with the podcast,
and hopefully formula. This one too. Yeah, it's a fun formula.
Yeah, it is. I've had a lot of fun. I had a whole career as a policeman, and then I was a lawyer for a while.
I didn't know that. Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah, I worked intelligence and organized crime in Kansas City for 13 years out of my 25.
And you're Kansas City, as I'm sure your podcast listeners know, Kansas City, of course, was pretty big organized crime hotspot. And,
yes, it is.
Wow. Okay, that's fascinating. I didn't know that, Gary.
Well, so anyhow, what we want to talk about is something I've not dealt with. I'm coming up on 5 years. I think by the time I put this up, folks, I will have just passed 5 years, and I'm over 1 million downloads so far. And in this podcast, this humble little podcast that I started with another guy 5 years ago. But, it's been a lot of fun, provided me a lot of entertainment. And I hope I've provided a lot of entertainment and some insight into how the cops work and how the organized crime people work. We've mainly dealt with organized crime, and I've been able to get a few good ones on. I had one recently, Nate, you might be interested in this. A guy named Michael D. Leonardo, who was a soldier made man in the Gambino family. And he gave me a detailed blow-by-blow description of how he was inducted into the mob, that ceremony, by Sammy the Bull Gravano. Wow. And he was inducted with
Sammy the Bull.
Yeah, he was inducted with John Gotti Jr. Now, the reason Sammy the Bull did it, because John Gotti was the boss at that time, was because he thought it would look improper for him to induct his own son into his crime family.
Very interesting. Yeah.
And there's always been a lot of controversy about John Gotti Jr. being made anyhow, because they say he didn't really ever do anything, and he didn't last.
I've heard that.
I've noticed he didn't last very long either before he's talking 60 Minutes and people like that. John Gotti be turning in his grave.
Yes. I've heard that. The son did not follow in the father's footsteps, or at least not very closely. So.
No, he didn't. He didn't have the heart. And there was few like that. John Gotti, as he said in the wiretap once, he said, "I'm Cosa Nostra now, a Cosa Nostra tomorrow, and a Cosa Nostra forever," something like that. So he was, and this guy was a real deal. The only reason he went into witness protection and then ended up coming on my podcast a few years later is they started taking all of his money while he was in the penitentiary.
Oh, okay.
And then they sent him a message, said, "Well, you've been put on the shelf." And he said,
okay.
"Oh, okay." He said, "I probably will get back out of here." I wasn't getting a life sentence or the death penalty.
Mm-hmm.
That's what happened. I was talking to FBI agent friend of mine afterwards, and who worked organized crime with us here in Kansas City, and he said, "Yeah," he said, "that's what happened to the modern mafia." He said they got no sense of propriety, no sense of tradition, no sense of loyalty to anybody other than to money, and they just wanted.
I heard that. I've heard that. Yeah.
Okay, let's do this thing, and we talked a little bit about what to talk about, and I've done some stuff on Lucky Luciano, but I have never done that time frame in which he started making his move, starting with his original boss, Joe Masseria. I always stumble over some of these names, but you can help me with that, I'm sure.
Same here.
But when he first started making his move, and they ended up what I first read about one of the first mob books I ever read was talking about the night of the Sicilian Vespers. Now I find that there's a lot of controversy about whether that really happened. They really killed a lot of people that night. But the first book I read talked about that, and it kind of captured my imagination. So anyhow, let's talk. And I know you've written extensively about this time. Let's talk about Lucky Luciano and him making his first move, and then we'll go on into making his second move.
Okay, well, quick little background. Lucky Luciano, born in Sicily. Like a lot of Sicilians and Italians, his family moves to the United States because of poverty and terrible conditions back home. He's raised in New York City and, runs pretty wild, a lot of street gangs. He makes friends with some equally delinquent kids who happen to be named Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegal, Benjamin Siegal, Bugsy being his nickname. Meyer is actually busted. He's one of the first people arrested for violating federal drug laws because he's trying to sell opium. He rises up the ranks. He's a very clever guy, and he acquires the nickname Lucky because he was taken for a ride and survived. And I don't think for the benefit of your listeners, I need to explain what taken for a ride means.
No,
but he was kidnapped by three guys, tortured, beaten up, pretty much left for dead, and staggered too. He survived, although he had injuries. His one eye drooped for the rest of his life. But this was so astonishing, he was called Lucky. He starts working for Giuseppe, Joe the Boss Masseria, and very quickly decides he doesn't really like Joe very much because Joe is what they called a Mustache Pete. And that was a very sort of derogatory nickname that the young sort of mafiosa would apply to the old guard. These were guys who were very clannish. They only wanted to do business with fellow Sicilians. And this rankled with people like Lucky Luciano because he had friends who were Jewish. He was happy to do business with Jewish or Irish gangsters. He didn't care. To him, it was just a way to make money. And he regarded these Mustache Petes as kind of fuddy-duddies, basically, and they're obsessed with honor, more so than running a business. They'd always be fuming about some guy who looked at him wrong and, we gotta kill this guy. So there's some plotting going on. Lucky takes Joe the Boss out for a nice little restaurant meal. And on Coney Island, April 1931. And while, they're having this lovely meal and they play little cards. And at one point, Lucky says, I got to use the washroom. And he goes in the washroom and lo and behold, these four gunmen rush in and shoot Joe the Boss full of bullets. And Lucky's asked about it. I don't know. I was in the washroom at the time. I didn't see anything. Kind of a bit of the reversal of that famous scene in The Godfather. Al Pacino takes a gun out of the bathroom and shoots the gangster boss and the police chief, the corrupt police chief. Sort of a reversal of that. So Lucky Luciano has eliminated Joe the Boss Masseria. Joe the Boss. He's now faced the new head guy in town is a guy named Salvatore Maranzano. And Maranzano was also from Sicily, and he was initially sent to America by a Sicilian gangster by the name of Don Ferro, with the explicit instruction to sort of organize the Italian-American underworld into sort of a formal structure. And so Salvatore comes to the United States with this plan. His boss promptly gets thrown in jail by Mussolini's fascist government. So Maranzano thinks, okay, well, I'll just take the boss's plan and do it myself. Maranzano holds a big meeting with Lucky Luciano and all these other Italian-American gangsters and basically lays out the structure for what we know as the mafia, the American mafia. He organizes everybody into families. There's 5 families. And he outlines a hierarchical structure. You've got the boss, you've got underboss, you've got the capo. Capo is like a lieutenant, basically, in charge of 10 soldiers. And underneath the soldiers, you have associates. And an associate can be anybody. You can be Jewish, African American, Irish, whatever, but you can't become a formal member of the mafia. That's reserved only for people who are like, quote unquote, pure-blooded Italians or Sicilians. Maranzano outlines various strictures, like if you talk about this organization, which he refers to as Cosa Nostra, that means death. You're not supposed to sleep with the wife of a fellow member. If you're arrested, you're supposed to just say, oh, I don't know anything. Total silence. So he outlines these various ideas. And most of the people gathered, they like this because, organization is good, more power, more money. There's a problem, though, is that Maranzano is not the easiest guy in the world to get along with. And he wants to be the boss of bosses, meaning that we've got this wonderful 5-family structure, which covers New York City, and eventually will expand to cover, Chicago and basically the rest of the U.S. But Maranzano says, I want to be in charge of everything. I want to be basically the dictator. And the guys, again, underneath him, Luciano, they don't really like this because the whole point was that this would give them a structure, but they didn't want to have like one guy constantly yelling at them, telling them what to do. And it doesn't help that Maranzano is completely paranoid and not a very sort of stable personality. And at one point, Luciano gets word that Maranzano is actually putting together a death list. And according to legend, he has the names of just about every major, mafia figure on it, including Luciano. And Maranzano, again, according to legend, because some of these things are a little difficult to nail down because the mafia aren't big on leaving minutes to their meetings, Maranzano apparently hires Mad Dog Cole, who was a gunman who had worked for Dutch Schultz, who was a Jewish gangster. And Cole was basically fired by Schultz because he was too crazy even for Dutch Schultz, who was mentally unstable as it was. So that shows you, and he acquires the nickname Mad Dog because he tries to kill one of Schultz's associates by spraying a bunch of kids with bullets. They happen to be in the way. So, we'll just shoot them all. So this is the guy Maranzano picks to eliminate his enemies. So anyway, Luciano gets word of this. So Luciano, for the second time in 1 year, arranges a rub out of a major boss. He has a bunch of guys burst into Maranzano's headquarters. This is September 1931, dressed as U.S. Treasury agents. That's how they get in, flashing fake badges. And they shoot and stab Maranzano, leave him for dead. Luciano takes charge very quickly, and he reassures all the sort of people in the mafia families that Maranzano was a nutter. He was out to kill you all. I took care of a problem. And he also does something very clever, is that he doesn't try to become the boss of bosses. What Luciano does is he envisions this organized mafia, five-family structure being sort of controlled not by one guy at the top, but by like a commission that basically would be like a board of directors, to use sort of a corporate metaphor. This would have representation from all the major, mafia families, and they would discuss issues. They wouldn't just shoot each other in the head. They would get together, discuss issues about territories or rackets or a politician who needed to be bribed or whatnot. So Luciano sets this up. Technically, he's sort of the de facto boss of bosses. People treat him like that just because he's smart and he knows what he's doing, but he never tries to enforce he never tries to act like a dictator. He's smart enough to know that he shouldn't repeat Maranzano's mistakes. So Luciano is really, if Salvatore Maranzano set up an organized American mafia, Luciano really took the concept and ran with it, because Maranzano didn't really enjoy the fruits of his labor for very long, because he was killed within a very short time of setting up this organized mafia. So Luciano takes this and maintains this and just enhances the structure of these sort of, the five families and the commission, and becomes this incredibly powerful boss. And his strategy, he doesn't object to violence. Like, he's not a shrinking, wallflower by any means, but he sees violence as a means to an end, like a way to solve a business dispute. He doesn't order hits just because he doesn't like the way a guy looked at him, or because a guy spoke fresh about him or something. He doesn't dwell on these obsessive points of honor that the Mustache Pete's did. That he's happy to use negotiation, political persuasion, and just outright bribery, and a little creative thuggery mixed in there too, rather than just sort of trying to shove guns in everyone's face and boss them around. And this works quite well for some time. How much longer do you want me to run through the whole Luciano?
Well, Nate, let's go back just a little bit. What I find
Sure.
really interesting is the people around Lucky Luciano at this point in time, and how long they stayed with it. I mean, you go back, and they stayed all the way up till the 50s, 60s, and the 70s. Yeah. Even some of them. Right. We had this Joe Adnoy's came over with Lucky and warned him off about Masseria was wanting to kill him, and then you got Albert Anastasia and Vito Genovese, and Bugsy Siegal, and this Ciro Terranova, and Meyer Lansky was part of it. Meyer Lansky was part of the little crew of Jewish guys that killed Maranzano, I believe, acted like they were treasury agents. And so let's talk a little bit with folks about the people that were involved. I think Frank Costello was involved at that point in time, and those guys all lasted all the way through up in the 50s and 60s and 70s through the war and everything. It's just kind of amazing. Right. Even Lucky left, and the whole structure that he set up lasted.
Well, Lucky was a good leader in that, he did two things that were very smart, and that he was smart enough to recruit good people around him. He wasn't one of these guys who was jealous of his subordinates. So as you mentioned, like, he had this whole crew around him of very talented gangsters, and he didn't just focus on Italian-American mafia. That one of his closest friends and sometime business partner was Meyer Lansky, who was Jewish, who was not part of this organized mafia structure. He used Albert Anastasia. Stumble over his last name.
Albert Anastasia.
Albert Anastasia. Yes, I've got it right here. He had Albert Anastasia, who was just like, the creme de la creme of hitmen, that he was a rather repugnant individual, but he's the type of guy you definitely want on your side. And he had this whole crew of very, very sort of, talented, smart gangsters. And for the most part, well, Albert Anastasia was, shot dead in a a barber shop. But for the most part, these guys lasted quite a long time because of the second thing that Lucky Luciano did was that Lucky was not a publicity hog like Al Capone. That, he would talk to reporters, but he very much kept to the shadows. He liked to have a good time, but he didn't flash his show up and, at nightclubs and throw money around and stuff. That wasn't his style.
Hey Nate, you froze up a little bit. Go back to he didn't flash his.
Sure. A lot of Lucky Luciano's associates lasted for quite a long time because they followed his second leadership principle, which was that he wasn't flashy, he wasn't showy, he wasn't a publicity hog like Al Capone. Al Capone would talk to any reporter. He would actually have press conferences. He would go to City Hall in Chicago to basically throw his weight around. That attracted a huge amount of attention from the police and the federal government. Lucky very much stuck to the shadows. When he was interviewed, he'd say, "Oh yeah, I'm rich, but I made that from gambling and bookkeeping." He would always keep a low profile. He actually dressed fairly conservatively. He did not dress like a flashy Hollywood gangster in a purple suit or something. And he liked the good life. Like he stayed in opulent surroundings, but he did not show off his wealth. He did not drive around town in a gold-plated Rolls Royce or something. That it was all sort of like trying to keep to the shadows. And that's generally the longest lasting mafia bosses. That's how they behave. They sort of kept to the background, don't attract much press, keep a low profile. That's really sort of a good way for longevity in these kind of circles. And he was, I just stress that, Lucky was just a smart, canny kind of guy. He didn't tend to lose his temper and freak out and get obsessive about some slight or some stupid incident that, really annoyed him or something. And he probably would have lasted a lot longer, although he did attract the attention of prosecutor Thomas Dewey. We can get into that if you'd like, or we can go back, whatever you want, Gary.
Okay, yeah, well, I've kind of covered that about his time in prison, and
sure.
Let's go back and speculate a little bit about this when Maranzano was killed that night.
Sure.
I read in a book once, and they called it the night of Sicilian Vespers, and supposedly they killed a whole lot of people that night, different Confederates of Lucky, and they set up a bunch of these old Mustache Petes that they were afraid would come back and take revenge on them for Maranzano's death. And, I looked that up, and originally the night of Sicilian Vespers happened back in 1282. Now, did you know that?
Yes,
in Sicily?
I did. I just looked that up myself, actually.
And there's a lot of French people in Sicily, and there was a Frenchman that was trying to mess around with another Sicilian man's wife, and the Sicilian man came out with a knife and killed him. And the crowds got together and they started killing French people that were imported down to Sicily for some reason. I'm not sure why at the time, but they started killing them like crazy. They called that the night of Sicilian Vespers. But what I found out about this, whether this is true or rumor or not, I don't think will ever be known, because the police in New York City especially did not keep very good records on this kind of thing back then. They may have had some individuals murders and said, yeah, there was a lot of murders, and they were all Italian, but they just said, oh, well, that's how they are.
That's right. You hit the nail on the head, Gary, that the night of the Sicilian Vespers, it's kind of one of these things that's got a kernel of truth and a whole lot of myth making. That, Maranzano was killed in September 1931. And apparently some of his lieutenants were also killed. So there was definitely some murder going on. It has, however, taken on this grandiose and maybe pop culture Hollywood kind of image of 100 people killed in various horrible ways across the country. That really isn't borne out by statistics. When you asked about this topic, I looked up Selwyn Robb, who's one of my favorite organized crime authors. He wrote a book, The Five Families, which is great. I used to research. very good one. I looked up what he said, and he cites 1976. A historian actually did a study where he looked up all the records he could find of various, hits in New York and all this. And he didn't find that many connected with the Maranzano murder in September 1931. And the ones he did find, as you say, Gary, it was a little hard to, an Italian-American gangster would be found dead. Was he part of the Maranzano gang or just some freelancer? Or was he really part of the mafia or just some thug? A lot of it is very murky. I think it's safe to say there were some killings, but it was very exaggerated. Like, the Hollywood version's more interesting, this bloodbath with dozens of people machine gunned on the street. That didn't happen. Okay. But that really wasn't Luciano's style. That he was perfectly happy to have, Joe the Boss and then Maranzano murdered, and maybe a couple of their lieutenants killed too. But he wasn't like a sadist who just liked to wipe people out. So that really wasn't his style. He'd rather win them over or have them work with him.
And his whole life indicated that. I've kind of followed along his life. He would have meetings. He was big on having meetings. He had the meeting in Sicily in 1946, right after the war. Then he had a bunch of them come down to Cuba and have a meeting and iron things out. He was even the guy that organized the first commission for the Sicilian mafias, according to what I read. So he was big into that.
That's interesting.
How this took on this is probably where I read this. Joe Valachi, of course, testified in 1963. And I don't think he testified about this. They probably didn't even ask him about something that old. But when Peter Moss wrote the book, the Valachi Papers, which that book, it just hit huge. That book was huge. And that guy was a really good writer and well respected. But he reported that Valachi claims there was that night of Maranzano's murder, I have to quote here, was part of an intricate, painstakingly executed mass extermination engineered by Charles Lucky Luciano. And he claims that there was 40 Cosa Nostra leaders allied with Maranzano slain all across the country. So that, that kind of guy with that reputation using Valachi as his source, it's hard to overcome that. Now, Lucky Luciano, he co-authored that book, The Last Testament of Lucky Luciano, and he claimed it didn't happen. And so, I have to agree with you that Lucky Luciano was not that kind of guy. And it just, it would have hit the newspapers all over the country. Even the dumbest cop and the dumbest agent and the dumbest reporter would have started putting that together. And it's been pretty well reported at the time. Anything that when it's reported at the time, the closer to the incident that you can find some source that talks about it. But nobody talked about it back then, did they?
Right. There's a great quote. And it actually might have been from Lucky Luciano himself, in which he talked about Joe Valachi. And he said, the testimony he gave, he said it was kind of like somebody from New Guinea who all of a sudden was converted to the Catholic Church, Catholicism, giving an in-depth explanation of the workings of the Vatican.
I've never heard that. That's a good one.
Yeah, and that might have been Lucky who said that, because from what I understand, Joe Valachi was he was a mafia. He was in the mafiosa, but from what I understand, the FBI fed him a lot of information that they wanted revealed. And
that makes sense.
He didn't really know a lot of these intricate leadership battles and stuff like that. He wouldn't know anything about that.
Right. He was not in the know on anything like that.
No.
Rumor at best. But he offered it just like as sworn testimony and just like he was standing there, from what I understand.
Yeah. It's quite illuminating reading when I read the Valachi Papers.
Okay, well, we're at 30 minutes. I think I'll just, I want to get you, you seem like you've got plenty of time. I'll just get you to come back over the next couple of 3 weeks. There's other things I want to talk about anyhow. And I really like your idea on this on the mafia was not as much fun or as successful. See, when I was working these guys, I'll cut all this out. When I was working these guys, I used to think, well, you know, that they're supposed to be big monsters, but yet they live at home. That they may have a 2 or 3 year old car, but they just, you know, and they may have cash in their pocket, but it just doesn't seem like they really have anything.
Interesting point. Yeah,
And they weren't the kind of people that were invested in the stock market. And they weren't the kind of people that had a bunch of rental property out there. For the most part. Now the boss, he had rental property, and he was invested in the stock market. Our boss Nick Savella was, and his brother Carl, they were pretty sharp, and they did those kinds of things. But most of the others, you know, they were just kind of, one had a record store, but he sold boosted records. He made pretty good money off of that. But mainly they didn't, you know, they didn't really have that much. They had a family home. They didn't even have a big new home.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. Yeah, that was one of the more fun, amusing things in the book, Donnie Brasco. And from Joseph Bastoni.
Yeah.
I stumble over these names. In his testimony, he was talking about how the biggest thing that surprised him was how boring a lot of this was.
Oh God.
Because he'd hang out with these mafia guys basically in the back of this crappy restaurant or something. They'd play cards all day.
Yeah.
And then somebody would say, "Oh, hey, I got a great idea for some scam we can do or some racket." And they'd all run out and do something, and then they'd go back and play cards. And he's like, "What the hell is this?" Like,
really
more entertaining to have an office job, like. And he mentioned exactly what you just said, Gary, that a lot of these lower level guys were not living the high life. Like they had a lot of like money in their wallet to have like a big dinner, and then they'd be broke the next day.
Yeah, it was one score to the next. If they got a score, then they were fat and happy for a while, and then they start scuffling for another score. There's no money put away at all, and it's it ain't that romantic. I know that. But
ooh, that's interesting. That's fascinating. Okay. Well, do you need any more on Luciano? You got me, or?
Oh, let's just go ahead. I'm kind of want to go ahead and do some other stuff, and this is enough for one podcast. And